Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the United States following the Revolutionary War. We're going to see how this country changed and how it kept some components of what it did going. So let's get started. The revolution had a major impact in so many areas. One of the first big ones was it got the average common person able to debate the ideas of what was freedom. No longer was this the idea that was exclusive to the rich, the powerful, to the grand land owning and the rich merchants and planters. It was available to anybody. And one of the first things that we see is rejected with the idea of this new freedom is the idea that the hereditary aristocracy no longer had a place and should no longer exist. No longer was somebody a lord, a baron, a count, or a duke just because their parents were one. The old titles didn't matter anymore. You were who you were, and that's all it was. The inequality that was the basis for colonial society didn't matter anymore. The Declaration of Independence stated that all men were equal. Now, what happens directly from that is not all men are created equal. Specifically, all rich, white, landowning men, they are absolutely equal, but that's kind of where the line is drawn. There is the idea that democracy is a system where all people are involved, and that is true. In this form of democracy that was created because of the Revolutionary War, you have power if you have land and if you have the means to produce from that land. So again, that is going to mean predominantly rich, white, landowning men. The rest, there are going to be some places that are going to have more opportunities for others outside of that group to have power. And the great thing about democracy is that when everyone participates, everyone's voice is heard. No one feels that they're, not being involved. But when it doesn't happen, people get restless, they get upset, and they're more inclined to want to seize power, usually in a violent means. That's what happened in France, that's what happens in communist revolutions, and there was some fear that that was going to happen here as well. One of the places where we see the fight for right and the revolution take in this country was in Pennsylvania. Before the Revolutionary War even started, Pennsylvania was divided between your pro-independence and your pro-British groups. And when the war started, being part of that pro-British group was very unpopular, in some cases very bad for your health. So there were people who left, and sometimes this meant that those were people at the top of government. And lots of Pennsylvania's top political power kind of disappeared, and that left this big power vacuum to be filled by other individuals like Thomas Paine or Benjamin Rush. They are going to be signers of the Constitution who started their lives as definitely not someone who would climb that high. With the old forces out of the way in Pennsylvania, a new constitution is brought in that establishes for one house that says we will not have a proprietor governor anymore, and if you want to run for office, you can. You don't need to hold land to do so. In a democracy, every person's voice is counted as a vote. And the problem with that is when you're dealing with today in the 21st century, 300 plus million Americans, that takes a tremendous amount of time to tally all those votes. In the 18th century, it's a matter of the same principle, even when you're dealing with far smaller numbers. Democracies can be very slow. The faster version of a democracy is a republic, and that's what we have. This is as it looks, you elect a representative, and that representative decides on the laws. They vote on the laws, and you, as a citizen, elect them. Your voice is the thing that keeps them in power. And this system was meant to be kind of there for however long it needed to be, and it's still in place today. The great thing about it is it's much quicker and much easier to look at than a full democracy where you can say, okay, who didn't vote? Okay, it's that individual. Okay, how did this thing get passed? It was that process. John Adams, the second president of the United States, came up with this idea that a balanced government in each of the states needed two houses, one for the wealthy, one for the average person. And he based that idea off of what they had in England. And he believed that the governor of each state and the judges for each state would ultimately provide balance between the two-house system. The question of did you still need land to vote, that is something that had been debated plenty, and it kept going. The thing that changes is how much land do you need? And the farther south you go, the answer keeps being more and more and more. And the farther south you go, there are fewer people who have enough land to qualify to vote. So it's actually less democratic in the South. In Virginia and South Carolina, the governor is going to be chosen by the legislature, and that group is ultimately controlled by the wealthy and powerful. So this very quickly becomes an old boys club and a nepotism game. Vermont will not have property requirements, and they're also not going to have a poll tax. A poll tax is going to be a tax that you have to pay if you want to vote. New Jersey say women can vote if they have property. That was on the books until 1807. And except for South Carolina, all the states are going to have annual elections. And the great thing about an annual election is you were much more accountable to do what you said you were going to do, especially if you knew you might not be in office in 12 months. One thing that we see that happens during the revolution is the idea of religion. In this country, there had definitely been persecutions towards one religious group or another, Catholics sometimes against Protestants, Protestants sometimes against Catholics. But during the war, those were willing to be set aside, especially when you needed help from foreign powers. The French, for example, staunch Catholics. It didn't help your argument to say you were going to create a government exclusive to one religious organization while outlying another one. When it was all done and it's time to create this new government, there's a lot of people who felt that you needed a strong religious entity in place so that you could make sure you have morality. The idea is without religion, then people would be running amok and all kinds of madness would ensue. And that idea means that people wouldn't have a basis for themselves without a religion. But when you look at 18th century people, and even some of the founders of this country, framers of the Constitution, they were not exactly the most religious of individuals. A lot of them were deists. They believed deism is a belief. It says that long ago a creator God made the universe and then completely abandoned it. Deists believe that there is a creator God, but that creator God didn't do anything aside from get things started. Didn't send angels or messiahs or messages or demons or plagues or anything. One example of this was Thomas Jefferson. He created his own version of the New Testament called the Jefferson Bible. And in it, he just took a pen, or in some cases a knife, and he just cut out the parts of the New Testament that referenced anything Jesus did as a miracle. Jefferson created this idea that there should be a wall of separation between the church and the state. The states needed to have boundaries for what they would do to support a church. and that it was okay to believe what you wanted to believe, but the states would not support one religion or another. And that was an idea that some people latched onto and other people didn't. There was a lot of religious autonomy in this country. One group that was persecuted very early on were Jewish people. In fact, the only state that Jewish people were allowed to be involved in politics was New York. Every other state had a law banning Jews against being involved in politics. The idea of labor starts to change during this time. By the end of the 17th century, at the end of the 18th century, there is no more indentured servants, virtually gone. The North relied on apprenticeships, on servitude, which is where you go when you learn a skill or a trade, or you learn how to do something, and you master that thing, and then you are basically, you can do it wherever you and however you like. The idea of equal opportunity was really resplendent, especially with the idea of so many people in this brand new country, which we wanted to make quote unquote fair. Jefferson is infamously remembered for creating this idea of the small government, the government that could be for the common man. And one of the things that this new common man government did is it changed the laws of entail and primogeniture. And these laws were all about how a person's belongings, how a person's property is divvied up after they're dead. More autonomy is given to the individual to choose how that stuff is changed than before. They always say that war is good for business. And during the Revolutionary War period, oh boy, was that true. If you had a resource, a good that other people may want, that other people would want to pay more for, a luxury good, then, they're gonna. And sometimes this meant that people would stock up on food, they would seize other goods, and then sell them back at prices that were outlandish. Congress knew this was going to be dangerous, so Congress set up these price wages so that that didn't happen. But after the Revolutionary War ended, those price protection regulations kind of disappeared. And we've got this idea where the public good and economic freedom are now brought into question. Was it better for someone to be able to make money selling something at an inflated price, or was it better for the good to be available to all people at a reasonable price? And this is a question that we still face and ask today. During the Revolutionary War years, there were individuals who sided with the colonies, who didn't care about the war at all, and then there were those loyalists who believed England was going to win, that England was the right government, and that what the revolution was doing was wrong. And this was never really a huge percentage of the population. At most, it was ever 20% of the colonial population. You would see that these loyalists were treated pretty terribly during the war years. If you were a loyalist newspaper, you could be suppressed. If you were a loyalist activist, you might find yourself have your property taken away. Even if you just weren't adamant to fight one way or another, like the Quakers, they are pacifists. They were labeled in a very negative way because they chose not to fight. They were put in the same place as those who were actively against the Revolutionary Army. When the war was over, about 60,000 loyalists chose to leave this country, knowing that, as bad as it was during the Revolution years, it wasn't magically going to get better. And they created a new city. They created New Brunswick. There were some who chose to remain, but If they lost their property, if they lost their rights during the war years, it didn't magically come back. So for some of them, it really wasn't worth it to stick around. When you look at the history of this country, how Native Americans are treated, the answer is always bad. Um, During the Revolutionary War years, we could say that Native Americans would, quote unquote, side with the British more than the rebelling colonials because the British had set up the original land territory agreements with the Native Americans. Now, you could say, didn't British citizens also violate those? Yes, they did. And the violation of the Native American lands was where we get the 7 Years' War. However, England is still willing to say, look at this territory you had with us, this treaty you had with us, instead of the actions of these individuals. And that's why Native Americans might be more willing to work with the British than with the revolutionaries. When the war was over, lots of now Americans wanted to go into the land of the natives and continue to grow crops there. This is something that during the colonial age, people just were not allowed to do. Jefferson says this is a great idea. Jefferson goes on to say that even Native Americans should leave the new country and they should head west of the Mississippi, which was at the time an area controlled by Spain. And even when the Treaty of Paris, the treaty that officially ends the war, is drawn up, Native Americans are not invited to this. When you look at a number of slaves that existed in this country during the war, it's one of the bigger arguments of why are we fighting for freedoms and fighting for independence while at the same time denying freedoms and independence to the slave groups. You see, this isn't just a couple of slaves we're talking about. 40% of the population of Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina are slaves. Most of the founding fathers had slaves. Slave owning was, well, the slave owners said that the government should step in and protect property, and that property usually also included slaves. The fight to end slavery was really started by the abolitionists. The Quakers were early abolitionists. This group believed that slavery is wrong and immoral, and Benjamin Rush, notable Quaker signer of the Declaration of Independence, governor of Pennsylvania for a while, he said that if we continue slavery, we will bring about a national punishment, a punishment so great we couldn't even understand it. And boy howdy, would you consider what the Civil War was and how bad it was, he was right. And slavery, despite the fact that it was so unpopular and it was so contrary to what the revolutionaries were fighting for, still remains part of the Constitution, part of the new government, because it was a compromise. You see, the signers of the Declaration needed to make sure all the colonies were in on it. And when Southern colonies said, we're not going to be involved in this unless we can maintain slaveholding status, it was a concession that had to be made. Our early abolition movements started while the war was still going on. In 1777, Vermont banned slavery. A lot of emancipation laws start going into effect that say children of slaves are free at adulthood, that if you were a slave and you lived in the North, then you were still a slave. Just because you moved didn't magically make you free. That's not a thing that comes into existence until 1820. And many states are going to let free African Americans vote if they had the property qualifications. except for, again, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. You're noticing the same states keep popping up for that except or always. This map right here shows how the colonial, or how the original 13 colonies would expand to be the continental United States. You see in the right-hand side where the 13 colonies are, and then immediately to the west, the colonies, all that land until you get to the Louisiana territories and the Florida territories that was all technically America, and there was no treaty that said no one couldn't live there anymore. So people start filling this in very quickly. Women during this time of the revolution, they work just as much as the men are. Deborah Sampson, for example, she was a woman, disguises herself as a man, fights in the Revolutionary War, becomes the first woman to take a bullet for this country. Women were expected during the war to create clothes, to make medicine, to treat people, to pass information, sometimes even as spies. And when the revolution was over, all that disappeared. The expectation is the woman would be quiet, would be obedient, would serve the family, that the husband would have legal authority over her, and slowly over time be educated. It's kind of interesting. Slavery, we see very quickly abolitionists work to try to end slavery immediately. But fighting for women's rights, that takes almost 70 years later to start working it out even a little. Today we took a look at how the United States changed following the Revolutionary War. I hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time.